the idea of visiting Afghanistan as scholars, imams, community leaders, and the such. I mean, the idea seems to be fairly novel. I have to say, in many people's estimations, it could be described as being somewhat brave. Maybe somebody even say a little bit reckless. But nonetheless, it's something I personally admire. I personally think that it's a much needed step. And I think that it's important that people, amongst whom Muslims, but people generally try their best to break the blockade imposed on Afghanistan, whether it be media-wise, whether it be trade, whether it be finance, whether it be. So I think it's a good thing. But how did this idea come about, and why? To achieve what exactly?
So, firstly, thank you for inviting me here. But secondly, and most importantly, we've got to understand the actual beauty of this delegation is within its grassroots level, and it's a Muslim-led initiative. So that's the first thing. Secondly, it also follows many members of parliament who have been to Afghanistan, but also former General Nick Carter, who's also mentioned very clearly that we must re-engage the Taliban. So following that, this delegation...
There was also Tobias Eltwood,
exactly,
who
yes.
Also spoke out and said, well, maybe, it's now time to engage with the Taliban.
Absolutely. And
he came in for quite a flag, I have to say.
Exactly, and that's the unfortunate situation. Anyone who speaks about the reality on ground in Afghanistan, they are always, they're always ridiculed. And I think that's the idea here. We need to speak out for what we see on ground roots level. And that's why it was about 8 ulama who went from here. Ulama from different strata of society. Some are imams, some are teachers, some are leading different organizations. And we went there to see the actual facts for ourselves. And it being a Muslim-led initiative, the idea is for Muslims here to understand what is happening in Afghanistan so that we can do whatever we can, whatever is in our power for the innocent people, the innocent Afghans over there in Afghanistan. The question is, why do we do this? And response would be theologically, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he's made it very clear that the ummah, regardless of the boundaries, regardless of which ethnicities we belong to, we are one body. If one part hurts, the remainder of the body cannot sleep, for instance. The Quran has made it very clear for us, إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنُونَ إِخْوَةٌ, also رُحَمَاءُ بَيْنَهُم, that all believers, they are brothers and sisters, and they are merciful amongst themselves. As part of fulfilling our Muslim duty, we went there to find out what's happening to the brothers and sisters in Afghanistan.
So, in a way, you could describe this delegation as a fact-finding delegation.
Absolutely.
Carrying the values that you just spoke of fraternity, of brotherhood, of, basically also, my interest in this particular delegation, and I have to profess that it was about trying to ascertain what we carry as notions regarding Afghanistan, which amongst them is close to the truth and which amongst them is not. The suspicion is that a lot of what we hear about Afghanistan is there's a distance between it and the truth. But my interest in this is, what is it that you're going to find out? So firstly, would you accept that the mission was essentially fact-finding? Second of all, well, you tell me, what were you trying to find? What were the objectives?
Yes. So there were two parts to this delegation, two segments. One was fact-finding on behalf of Prosper Afghanistan, a new organization being set up as we speak. And secondly, on behalf of human aid and advocacy, we went out to do humanitarian work as well.
Okay.
So which included visiting an orphanage, sitting with the boys, sitting with them, listening to them. Some of them had, I mean, it was very painful. Some of them sang poetry for their parents who were killed in war. And just to add this point, I remember going to the orphanage. In one classroom, there were about 30 students, small room, not too big. And as we spoke to them, I asked one of our hosts, so where's their dining room? And where's their, where's their dormitory? And he said, by day, this same room functions as their dining room. And by night, this same room functions as their dormitory.
So this is basically their entire life.
This is their entire life in that room. So the humanitarian aspect was very heartbreaking for me, especially being right close up to something we are never told of, and it's never spoken about in media. There's just propaganda about certain elements, certain people, certain groups within that country. But we've got to remember there are 40 million people who reside in Afghanistan. And I believe that the media here in the West does not reflect the 40 million and their suffering that they are, suffering.
40 million who have been through war, upon conflict, upon occupation.
Yes.
I mean, the past, 50 years probably in Afghanistan have been absolutely untold difficulty.
Absolutely. I mean, I've been back for about a week, and I still can't take my mind off some of the things I saw. Some of the, the suffering, the trauma that the innocent people are facing because of that war. And what made it very painful for me, the other day on, BBC Radio, there was some security analyst who said, this delegation that has come back, of course there is peace because Taliban are not bombing anymore. There was no mention of the carpet bombing, the drone strikes every day that took place. The drone strikes did not...
That often killed the people attending wedding parties.
Absolutely.
And the social gatherings and the such.
Yeah.
No mention of that.
Yeah, I mean, it was sad. We her children. They were explaining to us when we saw a drone, what they used to do on the ground. We hear about the drone strikes, but what do? They told us they had to cover their nails like this, okay? And they had to close their eyes and cover the nails on their feet because any kind of light that was reflected off them would send a signal to the drones that there is life here. So this is the level that they suffered on ground. I still cannot forget the face of this elderly man. I mean, we were driving and this elderly man came out of his house, broken, and very old, and he could barely speak. And he spoke about all his sons who were killed during this war. And for us in the West, it's just a notion of propaganda. We don't think about actual human lives. The rhetoric here is unbelievable to me. And after seeing this, for me, it becomes even more painful. Do we really care about human life? Or is it just lives of certain ethnicities that matter more to us here in the West than every single human being?
I mean, it's what you mentioned is heartbreaking. I haven't been to Afghanistan, but I've been to other war-stricken regions, unfortunately stricken by our own bombs and fighters, and unfortunately, it's utterly heart-shattering, I would say, when children of the age of 9, 10, 11 tell you about how to avoid a drone strike.
Yes. Yeah.
Or they tell you intelligently and quite, in incredible terms, how to detect a landmine, or because you think that children shouldn't be aware of these things. They shouldn't be. But unfortunately, in places like Afghanistan, in my case, like Iraq, Syria, other places, unfortunately, this is all but a very, very common reality that children became so well versed in how to avoid bombs and shells and the stuff. That's all fine and proper, but I also assume that you had meetings with officials, with government officials. And you mentioned that those officials were also visited by some MPs
Yes.
before you. It's I'd like to assume what kind of conversations happened, but let me press you first and say, you were received by, you're given a friendly welcome. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
Firstly, because I know that the Afghani people are extremely warm, very welcoming, very generous, very hospitable. So I'm presuming that that's how you were received. But do you feel that having met officials in the government and those in streets and marketplaces, do you feel that you were offered sincere clarification as to what's happening, justifications as to why certain things are being done in a particular way? Do you feel satisfied that you were given that, or do you feel that people were sort of holding back, maybe trying to give you messages so that when you go back home, you could speak on their behalf? What was your impression?
I was pleasantly surprised. There was nothing of that. And actually quite the opposite. When we met the foreign minister, Maulvi Amir Khan Muttaqi, and also his spokesperson, Maulvi Abdul Qahar Balkhi, one of the main things that he said to us was, and I remember he had a similar white cup in front of him, and he said, if you see a white cup here in Afghanistan, then go back and just tell it as it is. If you see a black cup, then say it as it is. And then he said, if you see something good here in our country, please relay it. If you see something bad, then relay that too. So this was the very first meeting we had with the ministry in Afghanistan. Very first meeting, within the first hours of us landing. For me, that set the stage. That they are honest, they are sincere, and if we see anything that needs reporting, or needs critiquing, then we are open to do so. What I also felt in the discussions with him is a sense of demonization of the Afghan people and also the government. Some people here may think, is there such a thing as demonizing the Taliban? But they are people. They are humans. They have children. And even when it comes to girls' education, they too have girls. They have had to stop their own girls from being educated. And let's remember that. He turned around and there was a kind of sense that I felt from him when he stood up and he said, tell the people, and he said this in Urdu. Yeah. Before he was talking in Pashto, then we were getting translation through English, and there's a lot of languages. But he could speak a bit of broken Urdu, and he said, tell the people that Taliban insan ko nahi khata, which means that the Taliban do not eat people. We are not monsters. Tell them people that we are just like you. We have suffered war. We are fiercely independent people. We do not tolerate any form or shape of foreign intervention. And that's why we fight. An elderly person corroborated this and he said, look, we will give up everything. He said, look, we have our homes in the villages. There we have our cows, our goats, and our sheep. That's where we get our milk and our meat. We've dug our own wells, and we grow our own crops. That's how we live, as long as our land is free. And I could sense that sense of freedom I have not felt in any country before, including the West. It was freedom of the physical type, but also intellectual freedom, where you could think freely and not be indoctrinated by ideologies that are being forced upon you, as we sometimes here have in the West. So I felt that sense of freedom. I remember at one point when we were in prayer in a village somewhere, in a very small mosque, and I stood up and that freedom hit me, and I have not felt that anywhere before. These are people who refuse to be subjugated by others. And they have shown that in the past, 4 decades of them standing up with barely any weapons to their names, with no, not an inch close to the type of technology that the Western nations, the Soviets or the Americans had, and yet they stood. They only had one thing, and that was their faith. And they clearly and proudly wear that on their shoulders.
I'll come back to the issue of girls'
Yes.
education in a little bit, but I'd like to explore the kind of sense of pride that comes forth, and not the ill pride, not the
Yeah,
evil
yeah.
pride.
No, of
We're
course.
talking about the sense of this, what we call in Arabic, izzah.
Yes.
This sense of freedom, like
Yes.
you say. You know, when you're free of all shackles, you become of that kind of stature. You fear nothing. You fear no one. And obviously, I mean, this rolls off the tongue that Afghanistan has been, over the past 300, 400 years, various attempts to occupy Afghanistan and to have been made. Obviously, the most recent renowned was the American occupation that held for 10 years, was it? Or 20 years even.
Yeah.
20 years. And the one before it was the Soviet occupation. And both came to defeat. The way in which the Americans departed Kabul 2 years ago, almost to the day. We've just passed the second anniversary of that scurry away from Kabul. The images of that, I believe, are going to remain with us and going to mark Afghanistan for generations to come. The question is that with 20 years of being occupied by the Americans, what are the hallmarks of that? I mean, what are the physical, aesthetic kind of really obvious elements that remain of those 20 years?
Yeah, and just to echo what you were saying initially before coming on to that, they take someone, there's a poet who they take very seriously, who I really look up to as well, Muhammad Iqbal,
Of course.
the poet of the East, as he's recognized as. He also traveled to Afghanistan in the 1930s, and he wrote a couple of poems, and just want to summarize here that he spoke about the mountain dwellers of Afghanistan, that their spirit is free. And this is way before any of these wars, that they have a free spirit. No one can take over them physically or intellectually, right, or in mind. And he then spoke about the position of Afghanistan in Asia. And he said that Afghanistan takes the position of the heart of Asia. And if the heart is working and healthy and prospering, then the entirety of Asia will be prospering. And if the heart is failing, then Asia will be failing.
Wow.
So this is, and it was interesting that it was Maulvi Muttaqi who also quoted Iqbal in our very first meeting about the heart and the position of Afghanistan in Asia. But coming back to the physical realities, so before going to Afghanistan, I obviously had somewhat of a preconceived notion of what it might look like. Bombed, checkpoints everywhere, tanks on the street. This was literally what the image that I had because of Western media.
Yeah, of course.
Floggings on the streets, right? Hands being chopped off and flying everywhere. In reality, we landed in Kabul. I was with a colleague from the delegation. And the first thing I said to him, as soon as we got off the airport, got the sense of the air, the heat, and the airport and the people outside, was, to me, it felt like Pakistan 20 years ago. Because I remember visiting with my parents when they were alive, and it felt like Pakistan 20 years ago, meaning it just felt like a normal airport, normal people going about doing their business. When we got onto finally getting onto the streets of Kabul from the airport itself, there were hardly any checkpoints. For what I had imagined, there was not many, unless we went to official buildings. The streets were clean, okay?
Really?
The reason why I keep on mentioning this is I'm not going to compare Afghanistan to England. And the officials also told us, don't compare us to London and Paris. We still have a lot to do. I compare it to Pakistan.
Right.
And obviously, when I go to Pakistan, the streets are not as clean as they should be based on our Islamic teachings. Whereas the streets of Kabul I saw were very clean, very well kept and taken care of. The people went, doing their daily businesses. I saw men, but also women on the streets. They weren't all in burqa. I mean, that's a misconception. They don't cover their face, all of them. Some of them had head covering. Some of them had lighter head covering. They were walking past officials. Officials were not saying anything to them. Also, another interesting thing was, before we went, we had heard that the Taliban had banned women from going to the parks.
Okay, yes, I remember that.
Yeah, and then what was really interesting was we went to a vocation center for widows,
Okay.
which is run by Human Aid and Advocacy. And there were like a few hundred widows there. They're doing a really good work. And after that, we were running late for, I believe it was Asr Salah. So we came out of the vocation center, we were kind of rushing. I was slightly late. I had to go somewhere else before. And I was not part of the delegation, and I was running after the mosque. And as I was, hastening towards the mosque, all of a sudden, I heard screaming and, sounds of fun and adventure. And as I looked to my left, there I saw a park. It was open. Men on one side, women there as well at the same time. So I had to stop there. And I quickly made a video of myself saying, look, we've heard that Taliban have closed all parks to men and women, and here are hundreds of women, okay, so, half the amount of men in the same park at the same time. And there are officials, walking past. So for me, that was an eye-opener, that sometimes we hear something on media. Maybe it may have been about a certain specific park because there could have been other influences taking place, but certainly not the generic of what's going on. And it's not the norm and normative position of the Taliban. So for me, that was an eye-opener. And that was another preconceived notion of mine that was completely annihilated and broken. And also, in the West, when by the time news gets to you, however specific it may be, it comes to you as Taliban ban girls' education.
Yeah.
Right? But it doesn't mention, actually, primary schools are open. And actually, it's not all types of education.
Yeah.
Medicine, they can carry on. Education, becoming teachers, they can have vocation, they can carry on. Darul Ulooms, they can carry on. It's only secular specific education.
The headline is stripped of context.
Yes, and that's the problem.
When actually context is everything, particularly in cases like this.
And unfortunately, I think the problem is we live in a day and age of social media, and the only thing people are doing is they're scrolling. That's our habit. We scroll, we just read the title and make up our world view about a people that we have never met, probably never will meet, and we have now garnered this position in our minds of what they are about and the monsters they are. So this for me, this was an eye-opener, the physical element here. We were taken to a girls' school, primary school, and again, there were girls there that looked happy. For me, it was painful because we've come from the West, and 2 of the classes were held outside under the heat of the sun. And I'm glad and alhamdulillah that Human Aid, following that, have decided that school, they will be funding and working with that school to build classrooms for those girls.
Excellent.
So alhamdulillah, so these are the small drops, I think, where we need to begin. This is where we need to start.
But you're right. I mean, if asked, I would also assume that Afghanistan is firstly not as clean as you describe it.
Yeah.
But also that it's full of people carrying Kalashnikovs and armed and walking about and threatening people and telling them what to do and what not to do. And it's largely because of the kind of narrative that we're fed, but also I would go as far as to accuse my own laziness. But what you did was to physically go there in order to see for yourselves. I'm assuming because it was only a week-long or 8 days visit, you didn't venture outside of Kabul, am I correct?
We did go. We went to Pakman, we went to Kapisa, Najran.
Okay.
We went to a few closer towns outside of Kabul.
Right.
We obviously couldn't go further because we wanted to do as much we can in a specific location.
Okay.
But we did go to the villages and mountainsides.
But obviously, I mean, the news that 2 years on from the escape of the Americans, that you found a country that is, in a way, stable.
Yes.
That
Very stable.
is functioning, a society that's functioning, and a government that's... How did you feel the relationship between the government and the people? I mean,
yes.
Did anyone come up to you and say, listen, I don't really like the Taliban, I wish that we had something else?
Okay, so I'll directly answer that first, and then one of the discussions we had with one of the ministers from Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy al Munkar.
Yeah.
So there were cases where most of the people I met, they were like, they support Taliban because of the peace and stability that they bring to the country and the security.
Right.
There was a given. Everyone agreed on that.
Right.
From the locals to the minister, everyone. The only thing was that they wished that the Taliban could do more for girls' education. And the important thing is Taliban themselves realize they're appreciative of it and they are working towards that. And we will come to that later on in more detail. But in terms of the local public and their interaction with the ministries and the government, we went to, and you know, before I went to Afghanistan, again, it's from the images that have stuck with me from the, you know, the previous takeover of men lashing and whipping women.
Yeah.
Right? That image was there, that there'll be, their police force will be going around with sticks and they'll be doing that. 0 times did I see that, number one. And then best of all, we went to the Ministry of Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahi Anil Munkar, which is more of an advisory ministry. And we spoke to the minister. His name is Khalid Al-Hanafi. And tall, broad man, towering figure, very soft-spoken, smiling, very calm, very kind, very sincere. And we spoke to him. And it was an eye-opener. I mean, we said to him that, look, you know, one of the sheikhs, he said to Mawlavi Al-Hanafi that, look, you know, we've been told that there's a lot of strictness and a lot of harshness. This is certainly not the prophetic tradition. And he said, no, there's no such thing. And then he gave us a few stories. One story that stuck with me was there was a taxi driver. I mean, he got into some kind of altercation with someone, a Taliban official or government official from the Ministry of Amr bil Ma'ruf. He came and after an argument, he slapped that taxi driver. That taxi driver took that all the way to the Ministry of Amr bil Ma'ruf and lodged a complaint against that official. They did an investigation and found out that it was unfair what happened to him. So the first thing they did, they invited both of them in the same office with Khalid Al-Hanafi present, and they told the official to apologize to him, number one. Then they fired him, number two. And then he himself, the minister, I mean, does this happen in the Western world? The minister himself went to that taxi driver's home to apologize to his family. So this is, as Nick Carter, you know, Sir Nick Carter says, this is, Taliban have changed. The Taliban themselves say that, yeah, there are many things and many ways that we have changed. So that's why re-engagement is incredibly important. Excellent. So that's the first thing. Another incident that he told us about was, first of all, about the poppy production. It's almost come to zero. It stopped in 2 years.
How did they manage to do that?
So they've destroyed most, and I think there was a news article a few weeks ago as well, where a lot of the poppy fields have been destroyed. They're closely monitoring that this doesn't go ahead.
They were thriving under the Americans.
Exactly. So what the Americans couldn't achieve in 20 years, the Taliban achieved in 2 years. And we've got to, you know, give them some.
Which brings about the question: did the Americans
actually want
to end that particular?
Absolutely, yeah. So they've stopped that, and then he mentioned how there's a bridge there in Kabul somewhere where there were thousands and thousands of professionals who had, you know, got, you know, they got under the influence of addiction, and they just started living under this bridge. Wow. The Taliban, and they were just there. They continued to be there during the American occupation and NATO occupation. Taliban came, took them away, stopped the drugs, and started rehabilitating them. All right, hundreds of thousands of them.
Wow.
And I was hearing this, and I'm thinking, why haven't we heard of this?
Yeah.
Why don't we get to hear about this? Yeah. So I stopped the minister and I said, "You're telling us this. Why don't you put this up on media, on the news, so that us in the West can hear about all the achievements you've done, you've got in 2 years?" And he said, "It's already out there. You need to find it." And then and he's a very humble guy, down to earth. He took out his phone and he showed us went onto YouTube and showed us the videos in Pashto and in Farsi. I think it's our duty to kind of
translate into English, Arabic,
because
Turkish.
I mean, the way I look at it is, I'm putting myself in their position. They've just ousted. They've fought fiercely against the West, right? Over 50 countries of the West. Why should they now be in a position to explain themselves?
Exactly.
I don't get that.
That's a very good argument. I mean, they're trying to run a country which is being strangulated by the international community, and then we blame them for not telling the story. or not telling it well, not speaking
Or in
clear
our
language,
language.
or in
Yeah.
So yeah, that's
But I think
that's
just
a
to
very
add to that, so the organization Prosper Afghanistan,
Yeah.
I think they're taking it upon themselves to now actually get those videos and a lot of these things that are happening and get them translated into English.
Right.
So I think they're going to be doing a wonderful job to give an actual picture of what's happening in Afghanistan.
Let's talk about girls' education,
Yes.
because obviously this is the favorite subject for the world media.
Yes.
And for commentators and people who think that they know more about Afghanistan than the Afghani people themselves. The conception is that the Taliban are of a school of thought in Islam that sees that women are not to leave their houses, that women must be absolutely secluded, and that they are not to enter into the public sphere and public spaces, such as marketplaces, such as shopping malls, parks, and in the case that we're discussing now, schools. And that maybe young girls can be educated to learn how to read and write, but nothing beyond that. So colleges, universities, even high schools, girls aren't allowed to gain their higher studies. That's been the reason why IMF has withheld what's due to Afghanistan and the Afghani people. That's why many countries have a political or diplomatic standoff with Afghanistan. That's why there are some calls from powerful institutions and agencies around the world calling for a boycott on Afghanistan because of human rights and particularly because of how it treats its own women. Tell us what you saw.
So firstly, I want to make it clear to all media and everyone listening that almost every minister we spoke to, this was at the forefront, girls' education. But I wrote an article about this, and I took mostly from two of the ministries that we went to because they were the most relevant to us, and their responses kind of corroborate everyone else's responses. So the
Which
very
ministries
first,
are these?
the two ministries are the first ministry that we visited within an hour or so of us landing was the foreign ministry.
Okay.
So we spoke to the foreign minister, Sheikh Maulvi Muttaqi, and his spokesperson Abdul Qahar Balkhi. Okay. So both of them, and later, a few days later, we also met the former higher education minister Abdul Baqi as well. So firstly, just to introduce how we started speaking about girls' education.
Yeah.
So the very first thing that I kind of recall and remember, with Balkhi, him raising his hands like this and translating what Sheikh Muttaqi had to say. He said, the Taliban do not believe that girls' education is haram, and we have never advocated that. However, they moved on to mentioning where with Muttaqi saying that in Afghanistan, we have 10 million students, both boys and girls. Girls can study up to what they call Jamaat Shashum, meaning year 6.
Okay.
So that covers the entirety of primary school. Yeah. Once they get to secondary, they then have 4 avenues that they can still continue. Okay. So it's not like education has completely been stopped for girls who are at a secondary age. 4 avenues. Number 1, if they want to continue in medicine, any related field within medicine, they may continue all the way till university. They have facilities, segregated facilities for them. Okay. Number 2, if they want to continue in education to become teachers of the nation, they can continue with that. Number 3, if they want to go into vocational studies, so skills-based education, they can continue with that as well. And number 4, Darul Ulooms. So girls can continue their studies all the way in Alamiya till the end. And I remember Muttaqi saying, and in our country, he said, that Darul Ulooms combine secular and Islamic sciences within the Darul Ulooms. So in a sense, if girls want to continue their secular studies, they can do so through the medium of Darul Uloom, where they will be trained in secular studies as well. But then he said, there are a couple, or you can say three things that have impacted their suspension, not ban. This is the difference. So they haven't banned girls. It's a temporary suspension. Yes, it has been long.
Yes.
And we appreciate what the girls will be feeling, or some of the parents will be feeling. But I think we need to also look at the bigger picture behind this. So one of the things that both Maulvi Muttaqi mentioned and also Maulvi Abdul Baqi, the former Minister of Higher Education, said was, it is to avoid ikhtilaf. And I'll talk about that in detail. And number two...
If you translate that into English,
yes.
What do you mean by
So by ikhtilaf is to avoid any kind of infighting amongst the Taliban.
Okay.
Because they've just come into power. It's a new government.
Okay.
They are, for them, the priority is stability and security of the country.
Right.
And it can be compromised because of this. And I'll explain why that is as well. The second thing is intellectual colonialism.
Okay.
And I feel the Taliban recognize this and realize this. It's unfortunate that it's the girls' education that takes a hit on that, but they have no other choice. Right. And that's coupled with the idea is they had to revert back to what they were doing initially because the overall Afghan culture outside of the cities, in rural parts of Afghanistan, which is the majority of Afghanistan, girls normally do stay at home. So that's where, the background is. Now let's talk about the ikhtilaf. Linked with intellectual colonialism. So the former Minister of Education, Abdul Baqi, said that when they started, everything was going smoothly. Okay, they had girls and boys education all the way till secondary, college, and also universities. But then the more conservative ulama, they came to see within the universities that the government policy of segregation was not being held. There was intermixing in dancing and consumption of alcohol, again, which is against the policy of the country and against Sharia. So that's when they took this and they saw this growing in so many universities. And the difference is, he mentioned that there are a certain number, I think 20 or 40 universities that are government funded, as an Afghan government funded, and about 150 that were funded by foreign aid. Right. And they felt it's those universities that were funded by foreign aid and foreign investments by the NGOs, that's where the problems were. Right. And not only that, there was this effort to now divide the students or the general public against their government. Yeah. And it's at that point that the more conservative ulama, they took this matter straight to the Amir al-Mu'mineen, their supreme leader in Afghanistan. And they were basically forced to accept this at that moment, but as a suspension, because, like I mentioned, they've just come out of 4 decades of war. They have other priorities like the economy, the poverty, the security, because they still had, up until last year, attacks from ISIS, who consider the Taliban a non-Muslim entity. So they're still fighting back on that. That's why they had security for us, to protect us from groups like ISIS. Right. So that's the first thing. They want to avoid ikhtilaf. What I saw amongst the Taliban, I was taken aback. Again, here we heard that they're this monstrous people, who are just out there wanting to kill. That's their hobby. When we spoke to them about, the war, and now that the war's over, how they feel, and all of them, in humility, they said, we want peace. We want our children to live in peace. And it was a moment of reflection for me that this is complete opposite to what we hear. Yeah. So moving on to what happened then. So as soon as they suspended girls' education, because their idea was that we want to have segregation, okay? We want to educate our children on our own terms, with our own Afghan values, and most importantly to them, under Islamic teachings. And this is what the West did not want. Hence, all the funding that those universities was getting was pulled out. Nice. Now, the financial challenge, the teachers currently still teaching, they really appreciate them because their wages were then halved to continue teaching for now. Yeah. So before they could continue with that funding, now that funding's pulled, something has to be suspended. Yeah. So they revert back to, at that moment, to their old Afghan culture where women stay at home. But again, it's a suspension until they can facilitate for them on their own terms.
Did they give you an idea of what they were thinking about in terms of until when this suspension?
No, they all said we want this back as soon as possible. This was their idea. And the feeling that I got is they are working on this behind the scenes. That was a clear feeling I gathered from the former Minister for Higher Education. He himself is a champion of girls' education. And he himself spoke to us about this. I mean, the Taliban have their own daughters and they want them to be educated. They've had to put the ban on them as well. So what they feel is the indoctrination of Western values, ideas, ideals. So for me, putting myself in their shoes, they were basically saying to us in those meetings, we fought bravely, fiercely. We gave our lives, our blood, our sweat, our children to fight them physically. Why are we now going to facilitate their ideologies in our universities? Why are we going to allow them to corrupt the minds of our children?
Especially, I mean, one could, see their point of view, especially that even in the West, education philosophies are being discussed and whether they're valid or not. Education standards, whether they're achieving the kinds of levels that need and are required for modern life. So the fact that somewhere a society is free to think and to implement its own philosophy and its own method of implementing an education system must surely be represented. The globalization of education is not the best of ideas. I would have thought.
Absolutely. Just one point to add there, which I just remembered now. It was Abdul Baqi, the former Minister of Education, Higher Education. He actually mentioned to us in this particular meeting, for some reason, there were only 3 delegates. 3 of us were there. And in this meeting, he actually mentioned to us that as soon as Kabul was taken over, the Americans were ousted, one of the first things that Amir al-Mu'mineen said to him was, I want you to employ 1,000 female teachers straight away. That was one of the first things that he was entrusted with. 1,000 female teachers so that we can facilitate girls' education in our universities.
This is all quite impressive, I have to say. I mean, what you're saying is impressive and also to a large degree understandable. Obviously, there'll be those who say, well, why is it only the girls' sector, the girls' education sector that's being hit? Why not girls' and boys' sector? Since, the same remains. That there's been the withdrawal of funds from foreign entities and the like. But I'd like to see whether you got any idea of what the leadership, the government of Afghanistan is thinking for the future of Afghanistan. Right now, I'd imagine that emerging from the past 40 years, 50 years, whatever, that they're trying to rebuild. And obviously rebuilding a society takes time. It can't be done in a year, 2 years, probably even 5 years. But I'm imagining that that's what's occupying them. But what are they building Afghanistan for? What are they foreseeing for the future of Afghanistan? And bear in mind that Afghanistan is a landlocked country in one of the most volatile, one of the most important, one of the most resourceful regions of the entire world. It's an area where, for instance, you have the new Silk Road, the Chinese Silk Road passing by. So this gives also sight to the strategic positioning of Afghanistan vis-a-vis the Chinese versus the Americans and so on. Afghanistan sits on the borders of Pakistan. Indian politics is heavily influential. It's not far off from Russia. So Iran also, you have, so basically, how do the Taliban see the future of Afghanistan amid all of these, which could be immense opportunities, but definitely they are quite considerable challenges?
What I liked most about their approach to all of this, and we spoke to them about in detail about various different topics, is their simple principles. I was taken aback by them. And I remember Abdul Qahar Balkhi, he came to meet us. And he said, we have 2 policies in terms of oppression and migration, for instance. And they've said to China as well, that, for example, when it comes to the Uyghur migrants and the refugees who are fleeing oppression, we firstly say that we speak out against oppression, wherever it may be, and we support the oppressed. So if a refugee comes to Afghanistan, we will not send them back, and we will welcome them with open arms, and we will take care of them, number one. Number two, they mentioned, however, anyone who we have welcomed to our land, we will not allow them to harm people or, residents of any other country. We cannot allow any plan like that to go ahead. So is there a very simple, outlook to the world? At the same time, for example, they have their close eyes on Pakistan.
Yeah.
And they see Pakistan. And not only that, they've been seeing Pakistan. And for them, there was one of the ministers who actually said, he said, look, we don't consider, for example, the state of Pakistan to be a Muslim state. And we said, oh, how is that so? And he said, they are not governed by Sharia, but they are governed by, in his Pashto accent, he said, Ain, the constitution, which is, still there since the time of the British. And they feel that, for example, and I feel, for example, with what Imran Khan said to the Americans, I think he was absolutely right in saying absolutely not to the Americans to continue their drone strikes. They affect children and innocent people. They have seen Pakistan, which has been a republic, and it's been a democracy championing Islam. They have seen the situation of it now, currently as we speak, with Imran Khan being imprisoned. So they are seeing all of this, and I'm trying to put myself in their position, and they would be saying to them, do we want a type of democracy which can be, where the West can intervene and at whim, get rid of, so as to say, some of their leadership whenever they like, whenever they speak the truth, or if their foreign policy does not align. They are seeing this from very close quarters. And that's why they are not only having a policy that's in line with the Imara, but they are actually becoming more and more confident that, look, had we become a republic, for example, this would be our state 70 years down the line again. We've fought 40 years. We are going to govern on our own terms. We're going to be open to the world. This is what they all said. We want friendly relationships. If you come to us with friendship, we don't want your charity. Okay, we don't want you. We want your investments. We want your businesses to come in. We want our country to progress. They are working day and night. Okay, and they are saying if you come with friendly intentions, you will, it will be met with Afghan hospitality. But at the same time, if you come with intentions to subjugate us, then you will be met by Afghan bravery. And this is their idea. So for us, it's important, I think, and this is why it's important. The EU have opened their embassies there. We, the British here, British Muslims, we need to push our government.
What's the position of the British government now?
They don't have an embassy there at the moment. And this is what Tobias Ellwood was pushing for until he was ridiculed and he had to delete his video. This is it. I mean, I think it's time that we step aside from the rhetoric from the West and look at ground realities, because there are people who are being hurt. There are people who are suffering. I saw this at close range. I remember, and I would like to share this here. We were driving and it was beautiful mountainous scenery. And then we see a broken house. And then this very, very old man, I can still not take my mind off him. And he came out, he could barely talk, he could barely walk, he was just standing there. So straight away, all of our cars stopped. And we had our human aid and advocacy people with us, so they had their envelopes of zakat. So they took those packets, and he explained how all of his sons were murdered during this war. And I still remember, looking at his face and the tears that flowing down his face. No news agency is going to cover that. Even if they can cover that, no one can feel that, what we felt. And on top of that, how can we ever come close to feeling his pain? And yet from afar, we just pinpoint just one thing, and that's girls' education. Not understanding, okay, why are the Taliban saying no to girls' education? They want to free their country of intellectual colonization. up until, and they've suspended that up until they can facilitate it on their own terms. This is what they want: a free education, critical education on their own terms. I met another man, and we went to Kapisa at one point. We met so many elders there. Why didn't we see so many young? A lot of them have been killed, unfortunately. In Kapisa, the French army was stationed there. And this elder, he said to me that, these French soldiers, they gave our children sweets by day and bullets by night. Another one said that at night they came, and he had 2 teenage sons, and they shot both of them in front of his eyes, point blank on their heads. I mean, these are war crimes we have to think about documenting here. And then there was this one smiling, elderly, flamboyant man, Ghulam Jan, his name is. And to give you context, it was like in a village, and I was waiting in this queue for the toilet. So you have to walk through a field, and there's a hut at the end. So I was just waiting there. And he came along. We had other friends who spoke Pashto and English. And he said something in Pashto with a big smiling face. And I straight away wanted to know what it was that he said. And the translator said, this elderly man, Ghulam Jan, is saying that your delegation are heroes. Wow. So me with a confused face, I said, how is that even possible? You are the ones who suffered 4 decades of war and trauma, and you're calling us heroes? And I asked the translator, ask him why he says that, because I don't see that. And he said, because every foreigner that I have met up until this day has come to kill me and kill my people.
Wow.
You are the first foreign delegation that have come to Kapisa for friendship and for peace and to spread peace.
Mashallah.
That's why you are heroes.
So tell me about the delegation. Now you're back.
Yes.
What messages do you have? I mean, obviously you're here, you're talking about all these things, but do you have in mind anything to say to the government, to the British people, to raise awareness of the reality in Afghanistan, of the thinking of the Taliban that isn't being reflected, of the suffering of the people of Afghanistan, not only now, but over generations? What's your plans now? Do you intend to go back maybe in a year's time or the such?
Yeah. So firstly, I think we need to look back at the cases of people like the MP, Tobias Ellwood, and look at when they did speak the truth, what happened to them? What did the media, how did they treat them? They had to go back on their words, otherwise their career was at stake. Some of our delegation members who spoke out, they were maligned. And this is exactly what intellectual colonialism is, and what has happened in the past to Africa and other, previously colonized countries and lands. So we need to look carefully at these cases like Tobias Ellwood, and look at why is it that Western media is so up in arms against Afghanistan. It's almost as though the innocent people of Afghanistan do not exist. It's as though the tears of the mothers have never been shed. It's as though, and the reason why I'm saying this, from that BBC radio station, one of the security analysts, and I think I mentioned this before as well, he said, it's peaceful in Afghanistan because the Taliban are not bombing. He just overlooked 20 years of American and NATO bombardment of the country, and he thinks that's okay. He thinks he can go on Western media and make a claim like that. It's Western media that needs to be more mature and more reflective and more humane, and they need to stop demonizing these people who want to get on with their lives and want to prosper and progress in their country. The Western media is, an institution that I would speak to and say, be more fair, be much more fair. If you're against girls' education, that's fine, okay? It's their land. For now, they feel that suspension is a priority so that they can have stability and security. Let them be. What are we going to do for the 1.5 million orphans in that country? What are we going to do for them? What are we going to do for the millions of widows who are in that country? If we have an issue, or if the West has an issue with the Taliban, then let it be. But what about the innocent? Where is our human connection? And how do we get that connection? How do we move forward? There has to be re-engagement. There's no other way. And former general Nick Carter has clearly said there needs to be an engagement with the Taliban. And when he was asked about security, and he said, look, yes, they have their challenges, but they have secured the land.
Yeah.
There is security there.
Yeah.
I saw this with my eyes. I mean, we drove everywhere. And like I said, if you were to ask me in one sentence to summarize it, Kabul to me felt like Pakistan did 20 years ago when I went with my parents. Yeah. They just need help and support to prosper. Yeah. Those 20 years are only going to be meaningful if they have the support of the world community. So re-engagement, stopping these inhumane sanctions on the country, because who do they hurt and harm the most? Those right at the bottom, the innocent Afghans. So that needs to stop. In terms of myself on a personal level, what am I going to do? I believe we need to work on every strata that we can. Yeah. And I strongly believe in small drops. They create large oceans. I have my own weekend madrasa that I founded in 2014, Fatima Elizabeth Frontistery. Yes. So we've decided that we are going to support human aid and advocacy in two things. Number one, with the orphanage, to try and increase the number of orphans that can be housed inside these orphanages, number one. Number two, to support the building or rebuilding of that primary girls' school in Bagman. But not just the financial support. No, we want to go a step further. And this is my plea to the Muslim community here in diaspora, that is not just the money that they need. Yeah. They've clearly said, we don't just need your charity. It's our skills that we have. It's our thought processes as Muslims. So what I decided to do, and I'm going to put this to our parents at our madrasa, is that alongside the financial support is to maybe have another trip of professionals to go to the orphanages. Yeah. These children, seeing them up close, singing poetries for their parents who they have lost. I can't explain in words how it felt. It is a very painful experience. And then for the Western media to forget that they cluster bombed the land and think that, Afghanistan is only safe because Taliban haven't been bombing it, it's beyond me. Yeah. It's caricature of the situation. Yeah. So coming back to the school, so to take professionals who are invested in mental health and they can support children who are suffering trauma of war. They were born in war, and this is the first time they're seeing peace. Right? So how can we support their traumas? If any of them are suffering from mental health, how we can maybe train some of the teachers, some of the staff there, and start speaking to them about that. To train some of the teachers at the school to talk about special needs, especially related to the trauma of war, and how we can help them and support them so they can have fun, much more. When I spoke to some of the girls in the primary school, it was. I mean, I wanted to talk to them on a human level. So my questions to them were, what games do you play at school? And they gave like a version, which the translator explained, of cops and robbers, where you chase each other. And then I said, what about sports? Which sports do you like the most? Because I was trying to gather an idea of how can we help them. Yeah. And so, what sports do you like? Oh, we love volleyball. All of them at once, in unison. So they have so much. And I also asked them. And this kind of, for me, was interesting because of thinking of intellectual colonialism, coming from Pakistan, where almost every second person wants to come to the West. Yeah. I asked the girls there, would you like to come to England with us? And all of them said, one of them started doing this, no, we don't want to come. So they haven't been impacted by, the flash of the West. Yes. Because at the end of the day, we both live lives. The people of Afghanistan live lives, we live lives. We live it in a very different way under capitalism, materialism. And since coming back from Afghanistan, actually, I've been thinking a lot about my own reflection on myself and how much I have been influenced by the materialism of the West. Yeah. And the simplicity of the Afghans, where they can live in their house with their cows and their goats. It's
inspiring, isn't it?
Very inspiring. And then when you see their faces, they shone. Yeah. I saw that confidence in their face, that bravery. They're calm. They don't have much to eat, but they will never ask you. They don't have anything. They will sacrifice their only sheep they have in their garden for you, just for hospitality, and they would go hungry. These are the people who are being demonized here in the West.
Thank you very much.
Barakallah.
MashaAllah, Jazakallah khair. That was excellent.